Hey friends, so today we're going to talk about how the Revolutionary War was pretty much like a cross between a Rocky movie and the Eagles winning Super Bowl 52.
Hungry dogs run faster, and that's the scene.
The American colonists were angry at the British Parliament and the King for passing many new laws and rules that they had to follow without giving them a say in the government. For example, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts. I could go on and on. The colonists outlined all of these grievances or complaints in the Declaration of Independence, which was a letter to the King saying that we were no longer going to be part of Britain. We were going to be our own country, the United States of America. The Revolutionary War had already begun at this point, and now it seemed like there was no end in sight for the colonists who were fighting to be their own country. Before we get into specific battles of the Revolutionary War, let's talk about what the difference was between the colonial army of the Americans and the British Army. These two militaries could not be more different. The British was the most powerful military in the world at that time. They were highly trained and disciplined, and they could fight on both land and sea. They also had access to a lot of supplies. The colonial army wasn't really even an army. They were actually what was called a militia, which is a military made up of ordinary civilians who volunteered to fight. Because of this, the colonial army was not formally trained, and they had very little access to supplies.
You need speed. You don't have it. And your knees can't take the pounding, so hard running is out. And you got arthritis in your neck, and you've got calcium deposits on most of your joints, so sparring is out. I had that problem.
Being in the colonial army was no picnic. It actually got so bad at one point that they didn't even have proper shoes. And the winter of 1777 was known as the Winter of Red Snow. Their shoes would wear out to the point where their feet would crack and bleed and leave bloody footprints in the snow behind them. These differences didn't foreshadow a good outcome for the colonial army. You could even say that they were underdogs. But they did have some advantages that we'll get to in a little bit. There were so many battles of the Revolutionary War, but we're only going to focus on 4 today because those are the most important and well-known battles of the Revolutionary War. The first battle we're going to talk about is Lexington and Concord because it was the first major battle of the Revolutionary War. When the colonists had met in the First Continental Congress, they decided to form militias and stockpile weapons. The British had found out that these weapons were hidden, and so they marched through Lexington to Concord in order to find and destroy these weapons. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott alerted the colonial militia that the British were coming! The British were coming! Because of this alarm and muster system, the Minutemen were ready in time to head off the British, and they actually ended up winning this battle. The second battle that we're going to talk about is the Battle of Trenton. You actually may know about this battle even if you don't realize it because you may have seen the famous painting of George Washington and his men crossing the Delaware River. It was Christmas of 1776. The United States had declared their independence earlier that year, and the Revolutionary War was in full swing. Back then, it was customary for battles to cease on Christmas Day in observance of the holiday because pretty much everybody was Christian. The British had hired German Hessians to help them fight in the Revolutionary War, and the German Hessians got a little carried away with the Christmas celebrations. On Christmas night, George Washington and his men crossed the icy Delaware River and hiked for 19 miles in order to surprise the German Hessians in the early hours of the next morning.
Why, in my day, a youngster knew how to run a snack bar, and he'd walk 15 miles through the snow to get there, too.
Between the hangovers and the food comas, the German Hessians were not prepared for this attack, and George Washington and his men came away from the Battle of Trenton with a victory. It's time for 7-second trivia. Your question for today is, which of the following men was a traitor to the Americans? A. Benedict Arnold, B. Alexander Hamilton, C. Ethan Allen, or D. Aaron Burr? If you chose A. Benedict Arnold, you're correct. Benedict Arnold actually led the colonial army to a number of victories, but he decided to turn on the Americans and spy for the British after he felt like he wasn't getting enough credit for these victories, and some people got promoted ahead of him. It's kind of interesting that he once had a man publicly whipped for trying to snitch on him when he was smuggling goods into the colonies, but then he turned out to be a snitch. The third battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga is important because it's seen as the turning point of the Revolutionary War. At this point, the American army was worn down and had sustained heavy losses. It's kind of like in the Rocky movies when Rocky's down and out and you're not sure if he's going to actually win this fight.
And Balboa goes down again from a right hand, bounces right back up. Getting killed out there.
But then he lands a good punch and he cuts the Russian.
He's cut! He's cut! Russian's cut, and it's a bad cut. And now it's Rocky Balboa coming after Ivan Drago.
In this battle, the colonists were outnumbered by the British, and they still managed to score this major victory. This win did two things for the colonists, which is why this is considered to be the turning point of the Revolutionary War. The first thing that it did was that it proved that the Americans were scrappy and that they could actually defeat the most powerful military in the world. This was important because other countries such as France took notice after this battle, and they were convinced to enter the war on the side of the Americans to help defeat the British. Remember that the French were still salty from losing to the British in the French and Indian War. So they were eager to help the Americans, but they weren't going to waste men and resources if the Americans had no shot of winning. So the Battle of Saratoga was important because it proved to them and other countries that the Americans could potentially overthrow the British if they were provided with enough help. The other important thing that the Battle of Saratoga did for the colonists was that it boosted their morale. It made them believe that they could actually win this war and officially become their own country, free from the British rule. Remember the confidence that the Philly Special gave Eagles fans everywhere when that happened?
And they're going to snap it, and it's Trey Burton who throws caught. Foles, touchdown.
I mean, if you don't have proper respect for the city of Philadelphia because you're like a Dallas fan or something, then I guess you don't get it. But like the Philly Special, the Battle of Saratoga gave Americans the confidence that they needed to eventually pull off a win in the Revolutionary War. The final battle that I'm going to tell you about today is the Battle of Yorktown, which is actually the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. General Cornwallis did something pretty stupid in the Battle of Yorktown. He led his men out onto a peninsula so that they were easily cut off by the Americans, led by George Washington, and forced to surrender. In case you're a little rusty with geography, a peninsula is a landform that has water on almost all sides of the piece of land, so that there's really only one side that's connected to the larger piece of land, like Florida, for example. Although the last major battle of the Revolutionary War took place in Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, it would be another 2 years before the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783,